You face challenges at work and in life, but instead of conquering them, you find yourself constantly reacting and feeling overwhelmed by every obstacle. Every day you approach problems with the same soft thinking, while others cut through difficulties with laser focus and unwavering determination. I am Sun Tzu, the ancient strategist whose warrior mindset has guided victorious leaders for over 2,500 years. What I discovered about thinking like a warrior will transform how you approach every challenge, giving you the mental fortitude to turn obstacles into opportunities. The battlefield may have changed from ancient China to modern life, but warrior thinking remains as powerful today. But first, like this video, subscribe for more ancient wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready for warrior transformation. I hold in my hands my father's broken sword, not broken in battle, but snapped in frustration when he realized that all his physical strength meant nothing against a cleverer opponent. This weapon taught me the most valuable lesson of my life. Victory comes from the mind, not the blade. I was born during the spring and autumn period of ancient China, a time when kingdoms rose and fell like morning mist. My father was a respected warrior, known for his prowess with sword and spear. He expected me to follow his path, to build muscle and master weapons. But I was small, weak by his standards, and every training session ended with his disappointment and my bruises. The turning point came when I was 12 years old. A neighboring warlord had been stealing our grain supplies for months. My father, predictably, wanted to meet force with force, gather our soldiers, and attack their stronghold directly. I watched him pace our compound, his face red with anger, his fists clenched around that sword handle. "Father," I said quietly, "what if we don't fight them at all?" He turned to me with that look I knew so well, the look that said I was too young, too weak, too foolish to understand the ways of war. But something made him pause. Perhaps the desperation in our situation. Our forces were outnumbered 3-1. I had been watching the enemy's patterns for weeks. They always struck our supply convoys at dawn, always retreated to the same mountain pass, and always celebrated their victories with wine that night. I proposed something simple. We would let them think they had stolen our supplies, but the grain would be poisonally lethally, but enough to incapacitate their entire force for days. While they lay sick and defenseless, we would walk into their camp and reclaim everything they had taken, plus their own stores. My father stared at me for a long moment. Then he laughed, not mockingly, but with genuine surprise. 3 days later, it worked exactly as I had predicted. Without losing a single soldier, we defeated an enemy that had seemed impossible to beat. That night, my father handed me his sword, not to fight with, but to break. "Son," he said, "I have been teaching you the wrong thing. Your mind is your weapon. This piece of metal is just a tool." The sound of that sword snapping echoed in my mind for years afterward. It was the moment I understood that most people fight their battles before they even understand what they're truly fighting. They react with emotion, they respond with force, they meet aggression with aggression. But a warrior thinks first, acts second, and wins by seeing what others cannot see. This same transformation awaits anyone willing to abandon soft thinking. In your modern world, you face enemies and obstacles just as real as ancient warlords' difficult bosses, competitive colleagues, financial pressures, relationship conflicts. But like my father, before he learned better, you probably approach these challenges with brute force, working harder instead of smarter, arguing louder instead of more persuasively, pushing against resistance instead of finding the path around it. The warrior's mind begins with a simple recognition. Every problem has a solution that others haven't seen yet. Every enemy has a weakness they don't know they're revealing. Every impossible situation contains the seeds of inevitable victory if you know how to look. Every morning for 20 years, I began my day by looking into a bronze mirror that showed me truths I didn't want to see. This mirror of truth became my most valuable possession, more precious than gold or weapons, because it forced me to confront my own weaknesses before my enemies could exploit them. The brutal self-assessment that changed everything happened after my first major defeat. I was 25, commanding my first real army, and I thought I understood warfare because I had read every military text and studied every great battle. My confidence was absolute and absolutely misplaced. The enemy general was older, more experienced, and infinitely wiser. He had studied me as carefully as I had studied ancient tactics. While I focused on terrain and troop movements, he focused on me. He recognized my arrogance, my need to prove myself, my tendency to overthink complex strategies when simple ones would suffice. He baited me into exactly the kind of elaborate tactical display that fed my ego, then crushed me with basic methodical precision. Sitting in my tent after that humiliating defeat, staring at my reflection in that bronze mirror, I realized I had committed the fundamental error that destroys more warriors than any enemy ever could. I had lied to myself about my own capabilities. I thought I was strategic, I was actually just complicated. I thought I was confident, I was actually desperate for approval. I thought I was learning from the masters. I was actually just memorizing their words without understanding their wisdom. That mirror reflected back a young man who knew everything about warfare, except the most important element, himself. Most people lose their battles because they fight the enemy they imagine instead of the enemy that actually exists. And this begins with fighting the version of themselves they imagine instead of the person they actually are. You tell yourself you're being strategic when you're actually being indecisive. You tell yourself you're being thorough when you're actually being paralyzed by perfectionism. You tell yourself you're being strong when you're actually being stubborn. Here is the method I developed for honest self-evaluation without self-destruction. Every morning, I would ask myself 3 questions while looking in that mirror. First, what did I avoid yesterday because I was afraid? Second, what did I do yesterday to feed my ego rather than serve my mission? Third, what weakness am I pretending doesn't exist? These questions hurt. The answers hurt more. But this pain was the price of victory. I learned that knowing your weaknesses is not the same as being defeated by them. In fact, acknowledged weakness becomes strength because you can plan around it, compensate for it, even weaponize it. The enemy who knows my weaknesses has an advantage, but the enemy who knows my weaknesses, while I don't know them myself, has an insurmountable advantage. After that defeat, I spent 6 months doing nothing but studying myself. I catalogued my emotional triggers, my decision-making patterns under pressure, my physical limitations, my knowledge gaps. I identified exactly when I made my best decisions and when I made my worst ones. I mapped my own psychology as carefully as I would later map enemy territories. When I returned to command, I was commanding a different person, not a perfect warrior, but an honest one. And an honest warrior who knows his limitations can defeat a superior warrior who doesn't know his own. Your modern battles require the same ruthless self-awareness. That promotion you didn't get, that relationship that failed, that business opportunity you lost. How much of the failure came from external factors, and how much came from internal blind spots you refuse to acknowledge? The mirror doesn't lie. The question is whether you're brave enough to look. The scrolls spread across my desk contained intelligence that would change the course of a war, not because they revealed enemy troop movements or battle plans, but because they exposed the gap between what my opponent wanted everyone to believe and what he actually was. These enemy intelligence scrolls taught me that victory belongs to whoever sees through deceptions first. The warlord Zhao appeared invincible. His army was larger, better equipped, and had never lost a major battle. His reputation for cruelty kept potential rebels in line, and his displays of wealth convinced neighboring kingdoms that his resources were limitless. Every messenger who returned from his territory spoke of his palace, his ceremonies, his apparent strength. But I had learned to look beyond appearances. I developed a network of merchants, servants, and minor officials who moved through Zhao's territory unnoticed. What they reported painted a very different picture than what Zhao wanted the world to see. The first level of knowing your enemy is understanding what they show you: their public face, their official position, their apparent capabilities. This is what most people stop at, and this is why most people lose. The second level is understanding what they're trying to hide: their real weaknesses, their actual resources, their genuine fears. But the third level, the level that guarantees victory, is understanding why they make the choices they make: their deepest motivations, their core beliefs, their fundamental psychology. Zhao's cruelty wasn't strength, it was compensation for insecurity. His displays of wealth weren't abundance. They were desperate attempts to maintain an image that his treasury could barely support. His refusal to negotiate wasn't confidence, it was fear that any sign of flexibility would be seen as weakness. Once I understood these motivations, predicting his actions became simple. When I finally moved against Zhao, I didn't attack his armies or his fortresses. I attacked his image. I spread carefully crafted rumors that raised questions about his wealth, his competence, his legitimacy. I made small surgical strikes that embarrassed rather than enraged him, knowing that his psychology demanded overwhelming responses he couldn't actually afford. Within 3 months, Zhao's own allies were questioning his stability. Within 6 months, his treasury was empty from financing unnecessarily elaborate military displays designed to restore his reputation. Within a year, his empire collapsed, not from external conquest, but from internal decay, and I gained control of his territories without fighting a single major battle. This is how I learned that understanding motivations matters infinitely more than understanding actions. Actions can be deceptive, but motivations reveal the truth. A competitor who constantly brags about their success is telling you about their insecurity. A boss who micromanages is telling you about their fear of losing control. A client who demands excessive details is telling you about their anxiety over making wrong decisions. My system for gathering intelligence in any competitive situation has 3 components: observation, infiltration, and pattern analysis. Observation means watching not just what they do, but how they do it, when they do it, and what they avoid doing. Infiltration means building relationships with people in their network who can provide insider perspectives. Pattern analysis means looking for the deeper consistency beneath seemingly random actions. In your modern world, this intelligence gathering looks different, but serves the same purpose. Social media reveals motivations more clearly than any ancient spy network ever could. Professional networks show you who influences your competition and how. Public statements and private complaints tell you what someone values and what they fear losing. The art of reading what people don't say and don't show is simply a matter of asking better questions. Instead of what do they want, ask what are they afraid of losing. Instead of how strong are they, ask what are they trying to prove. Instead of what's their strategy, ask what assumptions are they making that might be wrong. Every enemy reveals themselves completely, but only to those who know how to look beyond the surface. The pages of my campaign journal are filled with records of battles I chose to fight and victories I achieved, but the most important entries document the conflicts I deliberately avoided. This journal taught me that true warriors win by understanding which battles advance their position and which ones simply waste their strength on meaningless victories. The costly lesson came early in my military career, when pride nearly destroyed everything I was building. A minor warlord named Chen had been spreading rumors about my competence, questioning my strategies in front of other commanders, and generally making himself an irritation I wanted to crush. My advisors urged caution. Chan's territory was strategically worthless. His resources were minimal, and defeating him would gain us nothing substantial. But my ego demanded satisfaction. I committed 3 months and a third of my forces to what should have been a simple campaign. Chen proved more resourceful than expected, leading me through forests and mountains where his knowledge of local terrain neutralized my numerical advantages. When I finally cornered and defeated him, I had achieved exactly what I set out to do and accomplished exactly nothing useful. While I was chasing Chen through worthless hills, my real enemies were consolidating power, forming alliances, and positioning themselves for moves that would actually matter. I returned from my victory to find that my strategic position was significantly weaker than when I had left. I had won a battle that didn't need to be fought, and lost opportunities that couldn't be recovered. That night, I created the framework that would guide every military decision for the rest of my career. Before engaging in any conflict, I would ask myself 3 questions. Does this battle advance my ultimate objective, or does it simply satisfy my immediate emotions? Will victory here give me resources, position, or intelligence I need for larger struggles? Am I fighting because I have to, or because I want to? The framework revealed that most conflicts people engage in are strategic disasters disguised as righteous causes. You argue with colleagues who have no power to help or hurt your career. You compete with neighbors whose success has no impact on your own prosperity. You fight family members over principles that matter less than relationships. You respond to critics who lack influence, credibility, or even genuine interest in the outcomes they're criticizing. Every hour spent in unnecessary conflict is an hour not spent on battles that could actually transform your position. Every unit of emotional energy wasted on meaningless victories is energy unavailable for meaningful progress. The warrior understands that strength is finite and must be deployed strategically, not emotionally. My criteria for engagement became ruthlessly practical. First, can I win? Not should I win or do I deserve to win, but can I realistically achieve victory with acceptable costs? Second, is victory worth the price? Even winnable battles can be too expensive if they drain resources needed elsewhere. Third, does victory advance my larger strategy, or does it simply resolve an immediate irritation? These questions eliminated 90% of potential conflicts from consideration. The remaining 10% were fights worth having, battles where victory would genuinely improve my strategic position, where the costs were manageable, and where the timing favored action over patience. In your modern context, this selective engagement might mean refusing to argue with people who can't affect your outcomes, declining invitations to compete in areas that don't matter to your goals, or choosing not to defend yourself against criticisms that have no real consequences. It means recognizing that every yes to one battle is a no to another, potentially more important one. The power of strategic restraint is that it makes you unpredictable to enemies while making your actual moves devastatingly effective. When people know you choose your battles carefully, the battles you do choose carry more weight, more credibility, and more potential for decisive victory. On my desk sits an ancient sundial that became my teacher in the art of patience, the sundial of opportunity, that taught me that timing creates openings while haste closes them. This simple timepiece revealed the difference between striking when you're ready and striking when victory is inevitable. The battle that changed my understanding of timing seemed impossible from the start. General Liu commanded forces twice the size of mine, held superior defensive positions, and had supply lines we couldn't effectively disrupt. Every conventional analysis suggested we should retreat, regroup, or seek reinforcement. But I had learned to see beyond immediate circumstances to underlying patterns. Liu was impatient by nature. His previous victories had come from overwhelming force applied quickly, and he expected this campaign to follow the same pattern. His soldiers were accustomed to rapid victories and generous rewards. His supply arrangements assumed a short conflict. Most importantly, his political position back home required swift success to maintain his support among the nobles who funded his campaigns. I chose to do nothing. For 6 weeks, I positioned my forces just close enough to threaten Liu's territory, but just far enough to avoid decisive engagement. We made small raids, conducted reconnaissance missions, and generally maintained the appearance of preparing for major action while never actually committing to it. Liu's frustration grew daily. His troops began grumbling about the delays. His supplies started running low as weeks stretched into months. His political supporters sent increasingly urgent messages demanding results. The pressure to act built until it became unbearable. Pressure makes people predictable. When Liu finally attacked, he attacked exactly where, when, and how his psychology demanded he must attack. I was waiting in prepared positions, with rested troops and full supplies. The battle lasted for hours. His defeat was so complete that neighboring warlords immediately began negotiating alliances with me instead of him. I had turned impossible odds into inevitable victory simply by understanding that positioning yourself correctly makes victory effortless, while positioning yourself poorly makes victory impossible regardless of your other advantages. The system I developed for recognizing favorable conditions has 4 components: resource assessment, enemy psychology, environmental factors, and opportunity cost analysis. Resource assessment means knowing not just what you have now, but what you'll have over time as circumstances evolve. Enemy psychology means understanding how pressure, time, and changing conditions affect your opponent's decision-making. Environmental factors include everything from literal weather to political climates to market conditions that might favor action or patience. Opportunity cost analysis means understanding what you gain or lose by acting now versus waiting for different conditions. Most people act when they feel ready, rather than when conditions favor success. They make job changes when frustration peaks, rather than when market timing is optimal. They start businesses when inspiration strikes, rather than when competitive landscapes favor new entrants. They have difficult conversations when emotions demand it, rather than when the other person is most likely to be receptive. But warriors understand that preparation and positioning eliminate the need for luck, desperation, or exceptional performance. When you strike at the right moment from the right position, victory feels inevitable because it is inevitable. The outcome was determined when you chose your timing, not when you executed your action. This patience requires tremendous discipline, because it means watching opportunities that look good but aren't optimal, resisting pressure from people who don't understand strategic timing, and maintaining readiness for extended periods without knowing exactly when the right moment will arrive. But the payoff is extraordinary. When you finally do act, you act with such overwhelming advantage that failure becomes practically impossible. This is how a small force defeats a large one, how a new business dominates established competitors, how the right decision at the right moment transforms entire life trajectories. In my private chambers hangs a ceremonial mask that I wore during diplomatic meetings, the mask of humility that concealed my true capabilities from enemies who needed to underestimate me. This mask taught me that revealing your full strength invites unnecessary challenges, while appearing vulnerable creates the protection of others' false confidence. The lesson came during my first major territorial expansion, when I controlled a small but strategically important region that larger warlords coveted. My forces were well trained, and my position was stronger than it appeared. but I was still vastly outnumbered by any serious coalition of enemies. Conventional wisdom suggested I should display strength to deter attacks, but conventional wisdom would have gotten me destroyed. Instead, I carefully crafted an image of a commander who had gotten lucky rather than skilled, who held territory through favorable circumstances rather than superior strategy. In diplomatic meetings, I wore simple clothes while others displayed wealth. I spoke hesitantly about military matters while others boasted of their prowess. Agreed readily to terms that seemed disadvantageous, but actually served my hidden purposes. My enemies began to see me as a minor player who could be dealt with later, after they had settled more pressing conflicts among themselves. This perception brought me exactly what I needed: time to strengthen my actual position, while they focused on each other as primary threats. By the time they realized their error, I had formed alliances they thought were impossible, and developed capabilities they hadn't bothered to monitor. The strategic value of being underestimated cannot be overstated. When people think you're weak, they reveal their own plans more freely around you. They make commitments based on assumptions about your limitations. They allocate their resources against threats they consider more serious. They give you opportunities they would never offer to someone they respected as a genuine competitor. But deception requires perfect balance. Appear too weak and you attract predators who see easy conquest. Appear too strong and you inspire coalitions designed to contain your power. The art lies in seeming capable enough to be useful, but not threatening enough to be dangerous until the moment when revealing your true strength serves your purposes. My techniques for strategic misdirection became more sophisticated over time. I would publicly struggle with decisions that I had already made privately, creating the illusion of uncertainty while gathering intelligence about others' preferences. I would seek advice on problems I had already solved, making advisors feel valuable while learning about their own capabilities and loyalties. I would express concerns about challenges I was confident I could handle, encouraging others to underestimate the actual threats I represented. The mask of humility served another crucial purpose. It preserved relationships that might be damaged by displays of superiority. Colleagues who might resent obvious strength often became allies when they believed they were helping someone who needed their support. Negotiating partners who would resist someone they saw as formidable often offered concessions to someone they perceived as struggling. In your modern environment, this principle applies to competitive situations where revealing your full capabilities to early invites, countermeasures you'd rather avoid. In job interviews, showing confidence without appearing threatening. In business negotiations, demonstrating competence without triggering defensive responses. In workplace politics, building influence without creating enemies who feel overshadowed. The balance between deception and authenticity requires careful consideration of context and relationships. Temporary strategic misdirection in competitive environments is very different from systematic dishonesty in trust-based relationships. The goal is not to deceive everyone about everything, but to control what information reaches which people at which times. When you finally do reveal your true capabilities, the impact is magnified by the contrast with others' expectations. Competitors who prepared for a weak opponent find themselves facing a strong one. Allies who offered help discover they're partnering with someone more capable than they realized. The element of surprise, created by strategic humility, often proves more valuable than the respect that might have come from early displays of strength. The lightning strikes seal on my desk marked orders that required immediate execution without question or delay. Messages that carried the urgency of moments where hesitation meant disaster and speed meant salvation. This seal taught me that perfect information is the enemy of timely action, and that calculated speed defeats careful preparation every time. The campaign where hesitation nearly cost me everything began with what seemed like adequate time for thorough planning. Enemy forces were approaching, but our scouts reported they were still several days away. I had maps, intelligence reports, and advisors all suggesting different strategic approaches. Each option had merit, each required different preparations, and each demanded careful consideration of variables that might change before implementation. I spent 2 precious days analyzing, debating, and refining plans. My advisors appreciated the thoroughness. Everyone felt heard, every contingency seemed addressed, every decision appeared optimal based on available information. But while I was perfecting my strategy, my enemy was executing his. He struck 18 hours earlier than expected, hitting supply lines I had planned to secure the next day, exploiting defensive gaps I intended to close that evening. My perfect plan became worthless because it was based on circumstances that no longer existed by the time I was ready to act. That defeat taught me the framework I still use for rapid decision-making. Gather essential information quickly, identify the option most likely to succeed with current resources, and execute immediately while conditions still match assumptions. The goal is not to make perfect decisions, but to make good decisions faster than opponents can adapt to changing circumstances. Speed in decision-making isn't recklessness, it's understanding the difference between information that matters and information that merely makes you feel more confident. Most people delay decisions while gathering data that won't actually change their choice, seeking certainty that doesn't exist, or building consensus that dilutes accountability. The warrior's approach to incomplete information is to act on what you know rather than wait for what you might learn. In battle, I needed to know enemy positions and approximate numbers. I didn't need to know every soldier's name or every weapon's condition. In business, you need to know market demand and competitive landscape. You don't need to know every customer's preference or every rival's plan. My method for building decision-making confidence under pressure became systematic. First, identify the decision point, the latest moment you can act while still maintaining advantage. Second, gather information until you reach that point, but no longer. Third, choose the option with the highest probability of success given current knowledge. Fourth, commit fully to execution rather than continuing to second-guess the choice. This approach works because most advantages disappear quickly in competitive environments. The job opportunity that seems perfect today may be filled tomorrow. The investment that looks promising this week may be overpriced next month. The relationship conflict that could be resolved now may become irreparable after emotions escalate. Lightning strikes because it finds the path of least resistance and follows it instantly. Hesitation allows resistance to build alternatives, to disappear, and opportunities to pass to those willing to act on imperfect information. The warrior who strikes like lightning doesn't need perfect conditions. He needs the courage to act when conditions are merely adequate. In my study lies a smooth river stone that taught me more about strategy than any military manual, the stone that showed me how persistence and flexibility work together to reshape the landscape itself. This simple object revealed why water defeats rock, not through force, but through the patient willingness to flow around every obstacle while never abandoning its destination. My most devastating early defeat came from rigid thinking disguised as principled leadership. I had developed what I considered a brilliant strategic plan for conquering the Wei territory, a three-pronged attack that would split enemy forces and create multiple advantages simultaneously. The plan was elegant, thorough, and completely logical, based on everything I knew about the terrain, the enemy, and the available resources. But real battles don't unfold according to elegant plans. The Western Column encountered unexpected resistance that slowed their advance by 2 days. The Eastern forces found their route blocked by floods that hadn't existed when I drew up the strategy. The central attack proceeded exactly as planned, which meant they advanced into a trap because the other elements weren't in position to support them. Instead of adapting to these changed circumstances, I insisted that the original plan be followed. I sent orders demanding that forces overcome obstacles through greater effort rather than different approaches. I treated setbacks as temporary inconveniences rather than information requiring strategic adjustment. My rigidity turned manageable challenges into catastrophic failures. After that defeat, I spent months studying how it flows around rocks, through valleys, over cliffs, always moving toward its destination but never insisting on a particular path. Water succeeds because it maintains absolute clarity about its objective, while remaining completely flexible about its methods. I developed a system for maintaining core principles while adapting tactics based on 3 levels of flexibility. Method. Flexibility means changing how you do something while keeping the goal unchanged. Route flexibility means finding different paths to the same destination when obstacles block your preferred approach. Timeline flexibility means adjusting when you act while preserving what you're trying to achieve. The key insight is that adaptability is strength, not weakness. It demonstrates mastery of principles rather than abandonment of them. Weak leaders change their goals when they encounter obstacles. Strong leaders change their methods while keeping their objectives clear. True warriors understand that the mission remains constant while everything else can be modified in service of that mission. This approach transformed how I handled subsequent campaigns. When enemy forces occupied the high ground I intended to take, I didn't attack uphill. I created conditions that forced them to come down to me. When supply lines were threatened, I didn't reinforce them. I established new ones through routes enemies weren't monitoring. When allies proved unreliable, I didn't try to make them reliably. Built strategies that didn't depend on their consistency. In your modern context, this might mean changing your career path when industries shift, but not changing your core values. Adapting your business model when markets evolve, but not abandoning your fundamental purpose. Modifying your approach to relationships when circumstances change, but not compromising your authentic self. The Riverstone reminds me that obstacles are temporary, but persistence is permanent. Water doesn't defeat rock through single dramatic strikes. It defeats rock through countless small adaptations, each one flowing around resistance while maintaining relentless forward movement. Flexibility is how you maintain momentum when force would create stalemate. The commander's baton on my shelf represents more than authority. It symbolizes the moment I learned that diverse soldiers become unstoppable when unified under a single purpose, while scattered focus turns even the strongest individuals into ineffective collections of wasted potential. This baton taught me that warrior thinking requires ruthless prioritization of what truly matters. I learned the cost of divided attention during a campaign where everything should have gone perfectly. My forces were well supplied, my officers were experienced, and my strategy was sound. But I was trying to accomplish too many objectives simultaneously: secure new territory, establish trade relationships, demonstrate strength to potential allies, punish enemies who had insulted me, and train junior officers for future independent commands. Each objective made sense individually. Collectively, they created disaster. Troops received conflicting orders as priorities shifted daily. Resources were spread thin across multiple efforts instead of concentrated on decisive actions. Officers spent energy coordinating between competing initiatives instead of focusing on execution. What should have been a clear victory became a muddled stalemate because my army was fighting 5 different wars instead of one unified campaign. That failure taught me the fundamental principle that transformed my approach to every subsequent challenge. One mind, one direction. Every action must serve the primary objective, or it weakens the primary objective by diverting resources from ITI. Developed a system for maintaining clarity of purpose under pressure and distraction. Each morning, I would identify the single most important outcome for that day. Every decision would be evaluated against this primary objective. Does this action advance my main goal? Or does it serve some secondary purpose that feels important, but isn't essential? This discipline was brutal because it meant saying no to many worthwhile activities. I stopped accepting social invitations that didn't serve strategic purposes. I stopped pursuing interesting opportunities that didn't align with primary objectives. I stopped responding to provocations that didn't threaten core interests. Every yes to something secondary was a no to something primary. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. With scattered focus eliminated, my forces began achieving in weeks what had previously taken months. With clear priorities, my officers made better decisions independently because they understood what mattered most. With unified purpose, my entire organization became more efficient, more decisive, and more effective. In your modern context, this principle applies to career advancement, business growth, and personal development. Most people fail not because they lack capabilities, but because they scatter their capabilities across too many competing priorities. They try to excel at their job while starting a side business, while improving their relationships, while learning new skills, while maintaining social obligations. The warrior's approach is different. Identify the one change that would most significantly improve your position, then eliminate or postpone everything that doesn't directly contribute to that change. This doesn't mean ignoring other areas of life permanently. It means concentrating effort until primary objectives are achieved. Then, shifting focus to the next most important goal. Unity of purpose creates compound effects that scattered effort cannot achieve. When all your actions align behind a single objective, each effort reinforces the others instead of competing with them. Progress accelerates because energy isn't lost through conflicting directions. Results multiply because focus creates momentum that scattered activities never generate. The baton reminds me that leadership begins with leading yourself toward clear objectives, then inspiring others to follow the same unified direction. The smooth meditation stone I grip during crucial decisions has witnessed more victories than any weapon I ever carried, because it taught me that unshakable emotional control under extreme pressure becomes your greatest competitive advantage when others lose their composure. This stone absorbed the heat of my rage, the trembling of my fear, and the desperation of my doubt, transforming raw emotion into strategic clarity. The battle where my anger nearly destroyed everything I had built began with a betrayal that cut deeper than any sword. My most trusted lieutenant, a man I had mentored for years, sold crucial intelligence to my enemies in exchange for gold and promises of power. His treachery cost me 3 key positions and the lives of soldiers who had followed my orders based on information I believed was secure. When I discovered the betrayal, rage consumed me like wildfire. I wanted immediate revenge, strategic justice, but personal vengeance that would satisfy my wounded pride and demonstrate the consequences of crossing me. My anger demanded that I hunt down this traitor publicly, execute him dramatically, and make his punishment a warning to anyone who might consider similar betrayals. But anger makes terrible strategy. The pursuit I planned would have required dividing my forces, abandoning defensive positions, and pursuing a single individual while larger threats remained unaddressed. My rage was giving my enemies exactly what they wanted: a distracted commander, making emotional decisions instead of strategic ones. Sitting in my tent that night, gripping this meditation stone until my knuckles went white, I forced myself to think beyond my fury. The betrayal had happened. Anger couldn't undo it. The traitor had fled. Rage couldn't bring him back. But emotional reaction could multiply the damage he had already caused if I let it drive my next decisions. I developed techniques for maintaining clarity when emotions demand action. First, I would acknowledge the emotion without immediately acting on it, feeling anger completely while refusing to let it dictate strategy. Second, I would ask what response would best serve my long-term objectives rather than my immediate feelings. Third, I would consider how my enemies expected me to react, then choose a different approach that would surprise them. Instead of pursuing the traitor, I used his betrayal as an opportunity. I fed false information through channels I suspected were compromised, leading my enemies into positions where they became vulnerable. I turned the betrayal into a recruitment tool, showing other potential allies how I handled treachery with strategic discipline rather than emotional chaos. I transformed a moment of weakness into a demonstration of strength. The warrior's approach to fear, anger, and other destabilizing emotions is not to suppress them, but to use them as information, while refusing to let them control decisions. Fear tells you what matters most to you. Use that knowledge to prioritize protection efforts. Anger reveals what principles have been violated. Use that clarity to establish better boundaries. Doubt identifies areas of uncertainty. Use that awareness to gather better information. Emotional mastery doesn't mean becoming emotionless, means becoming emotionally intelligent. You feel everything, but you respond strategically rather than reactively. You acknowledge the signal emotions provide while maintaining control over the actions you choose. In high-pressure meetings, this might mean feeling frustration with difficult colleagues while maintaining a calm exterior that serves your professional objectives. In negotiations, it might mean experiencing anxiety about outcomes while projecting confidence that strengthens your position. In conflicts, it might mean feeling hurt by personal attacks while responding with strategic composure that demonstrates your character. The meditation stone reminds me that emotions are temporary visitors, not permanent residents. They arrive, deliver their message, and depart, but only if you maintain the inner stillness that allows you to hear their wisdom without being controlled by their intensity. This emotional mastery becomes the foundation for every other warrior skill, because clear thinking under pressure is impossible when emotions dictate responses. The supply master's abacus on my desk taught me that wars are won by logistics, not just tactics. That the counting tool which tracked grain, weapons, and gold often determined victory more decisively than any battlefield maneuver. This simple, calculating device revealed that efficiency is the warrior's secret weapon against opponents with superior resources. The campaign, where resource management defeated a larger army, began with impossible mathematics. General Wang commanded forces 3 times the size of mine, controlled territory twice as productive as ours, and had treasury reserves that dwarfed our entire annual budget. By every conventional measure, prolonged conflict favored him enormously. His advantages would compound over time, while our limitations would become increasingly crippling. But I had learned to see resources differently than most commanders. While Wang measured strength in absolute terms, total soldiers, total supplies, total gold, I measured it in efficiency terms, results per soldier, impact per supply unit, strategic advantage per coin spent. This perspective revealed opportunities that absolute thinking missed. Wang's larger army required proportionally more food, more equipment maintenance, more administrative overhead. His supply lines were longer and more vulnerable. His communication networks were more complex and slower. His decision-making processes involved more people and took more time. Every advantage he possessed created corresponding disadvantages that efficient opponents could exploit. My strategy became surgical resource deployment. Instead of matching Wang's expenditures across all areas, I concentrated superior resources in specific locations at specific times. When he spread his forces to cover all possible approaches, I massed mine against his weakest positions. When he stockpiled supplies for extended campaigns, I struck fast and returned to bases that required minimal maintenance. The mathematics worked beautifully. Wang's army consumed resources at 3 times my rate, but didn't achieve 3 times. The results? My smaller, more efficient forces accomplished strategic objectives, while his larger forces managed logistics. Within 6 months, Wang's advantages had become liabilities. His size made him slow. His wealth made him wasteful. His abundance made him careless. I developed a system for maximizing impact, while minimizing expenditure that applies far beyond military contexts. First, identify bottleneck resources, the constraints that limit overall performance more than any other factor. Second, eliminate waste in non-bottleneck areas to free up resources for bottleneck improvements. Third, measure results per unit of investment rather than absolute results. Fourth, concentrate superior resources at decisive points rather than spreading them evenly. This approach works because most people confuse activity with achievement, spending with results, effort with effectiveness. They hire more people instead of training existing staff better. They buy more equipment instead of using current tools more efficiently. They work longer hours instead of working more strategically. By source efficiency creates compound advantages that absolute resource superiority cannot match. Efficient organizations can sustain longer campaigns, adapt faster to changing conditions, and achieve better results with smaller investments. They become more resilient because they're not dependent on maintaining high resource levels, and more agile because they're not weighed down by resource-intensive processes. In your modern context, this might mean focusing training budgets on skills that create multiple benefits rather than spreading development efforts across many areas. It might mean investing time in relationships that provide access to networks rather than maintaining casual acquaintanceships with everyone. It might mean choosing projects that build capabilities while achieving immediate objectives. The abacus reminds me that every resource, time, money, attention, energies, finite and must be deployed strategically. Victory goes not to those with the most resources, but to those who achieve the most with what they have. The small jade token on my desk represents the most valuable network I ever built, not an army of soldiers, but a web of informants who gave me eyes and ears in every corner of my world. This spy network token taught me that information superiority determines victory before battles begin, because knowing what others don't know creates advantages that force and courage cannot match. That the intelligence breakthrough that changed the course of an entire war came from an unlikely source, a kitchen servant in my enemy's household who was angered by years of cruel treatment. She couldn't read military documents or attend strategic meetings, but she could observe patterns that revealed more than any formal intelligence report. She noticed that her master, General Liang, always ate specific foods before major military decisions, rare delicacies that required advance ordering from distant suppliers. She observed that certain messengers arrived at predictable intervals before troop movements. She saw which advisors were called for secret meetings and which were excluded, revealing the inner circle that actually influenced decision-making. This servant provided information that no spy placed among Liang's officers could have gathered, because she was invisible to people who didn't consider servants worth noticing. Her intelligence allowed me to predict Liang's actions days in advance, position my forces accordingly, and create the appearance of supernatural strategic foresight. That experience taught me that effective intelligence networks require diversity of sources, not just access to high-level information. The merchant who travels between territories knows about resource movements. The messenger who carries documents understands communication patterns. The stable hand who tends horses recognizes preparation for rapid movement. Each perspective provides pieces of a larger picture that no single source could reveal completely. My system for gathering, verifying, and acting on crucial information became methodical and comprehensive. First, I identified what I needed to know, not everything that might be interesting, but specific information that would change my strategic decisions. Second, I built multiple sources for each category of intelligence, because single sources can be deceived, compromised, or simply wrong. Third, I created verification methods that cross-checked information through different channels. Fourth, I established communication systems that could deliver time-sensitive intelligence quickly, enough to act on it. The art of asking the right questions proved more valuable than having access to the right people. Instead of asking, "What is my enemy planning?" I learned to ask, "What constraints limit my enemy's options?" Instead of asking, "When will they attack?" I asked what conditions would force them to attack. Instead of asking, "How strong are they?" I asked, "What do they need that they don't have?" These questions revealed patterns and motivations that direct questions about plans and intentions often missed. People lie about their intentions, but they can't hide their limitations. They can deceive about their timeline, but they can't change their resource requirements. They can misdirect about their strategies, but they can't eliminate the constraints that shape their options. In your modern environment, this intelligence gathering looks different but serves the same strategic purposes. Social media reveals motivations and concerns more clearly than any ancient spy network. Professional networks show you influence patterns and relationship dynamics. Public records and industry reports provide information about capabilities and constraints that most people don't bother to research. The Jade token reminds me that information is only valuable when it changes decisions, and decisions are only valuable when they're made in time to matter. The warrior who knows everything but acts too late loses to the warrior who knows enough and acts quickly. The propaganda scroll displayed in my study contains words that conquered a fortified city without firing a single arrow. Messages that convinced enemies to surrender and allies to remain loyal through the power of carefully crafted psychological pressure. This scroll taught me that perception often matters more than reality in achieving victory, because people fight harder for what they believe than for what merely exists. The siege I won through psychological warfare rather than physical force seemed impossible by conventional standards. The fortress of Changshan was considered impregnable. Thick walls, elevated position, abundant supplies, and defenders who had successfully resisted multiple previous attacks. Traditional siege tactics would have required months of costly assault, with uncertain outcomes. Instead of attacking walls, I attacked mines. Instead of targeting their defenses, I targeted their confidence. Instead of trying to break their fortress, I undermined their belief that the fortress could save them. I began by spreading carefully crafted stories about previous sieges where defenders had held out for months, only to be slaughtered when their positions were finally overrun. These stories weren't threats, they were presented as historical facts, delivered through channels that seemed independent of my forces. The defenders heard these accounts from merchants, traveling monks, and refugees, making them appear more credible than direct propaganda. Simultaneously, I demonstrated unusual confidence in victory by making public preparations for governing the territory after conquest, appointing administrators, planning infrastructure improvements, even beginning negotiations with neighboring regions about post-victory trade agreements. This created the impression that my success was inevitable rather than hoped for. The psychological pressure intensified when I began accepting surrenders from outlying positions while treating those who yielded with unexpected generosity. Word spread that cooperation was rewarded while resistance was costly, creating incentives for defection that physical siege tactics couldn't match. Within 6 weeks, the fortress surrendered not because it was militarily defeated, but because its defenders no longer believed victory was possible. The commander who opened the gates told me later that they still had months of supplies and strong defensive positions, but the psychological pressure had become unbearable. My techniques for understanding and influencing human psychology became systematic and ethical. I studied what motivated different groups: sona, security, prosperity, recognition, then crafted approaches that appealed to those motivations rather than simply threatening consequences. I learned to present information in ways that allowed people to reach desired conclusions independently rather than feeling manipulated into compliance. The key insight was that people resist external pressure but embrace ideas that seem to arise from their own reasoning. Instead of telling enemies why they should surrender, I created conditions where surrender appeared to be their idea. Instead of demanding loyalty from allies, I demonstrated why loyalty served their interests. In modern leadership and negotiation contexts, this understanding applies to building consensus, managing resistance to change, and creating buy-in for difficult decisions. You influence more effectively by understanding others' priorities and showing how your proposals serve those priorities, rather than simply arguing for your position. The ethical boundaries of psychological influence require constant attention. There's a difference between helping people understand their genuine interests and manipulating them against their authentic needs. The warrior's psychological approach should ultimately serve truth and mutual benefit, not deception and exploitation. The scroll reminds me that the strongest fortress is built in the mind, and the most decisive victories are won when opponents convince themselves that resistance is futile. The treaty seal that sits on my desk bears the mark that transformed my greatest enemy into my most valuable ally. Stamp the formalized partnerships with former rivals and taught me that warriors understand strength multiplies through strategic partnership rather than solitary conquest. This seal represents the moment I learned that building coalitions creates more power than fighting alone ever could. The alliance that changed everything began with the most unlikely partnership imaginable. General Zhang had been my primary adversary for 3 years, a brilliant strategist who understood my methods almost as well as I understood his. Our conflicts had reached a stalemate where neither could gain decisive advantage over the other, but both were weakening ourselves while other enemies grew stronger around us. The breakthrough came when I stopped seeing Zhang as an obstacle to overcome and started seeing him as a resource to leverage. Our prolonged conflict had demonstrated mutual respect. We were evenly matched in capabilities, similar in strategic thinking, and aligned in several important values despite our territorial disputes. Instead of continuing a costly war that neither could win decisively, I proposed something unprecedented: temporary alliance against common threats, with territorial disputes resolved through negotiation rather than conquest. The proposal required each of us to set aside pride, acknowledge that continued conflict served our mutual enemies better than it served either of us. Zhang's initial response was skeptical, as I expected, but I had prepared by demonstrating the strategic value of partnership through small collaborative efforts when bandits threatened both our territories. I shared intelligence that helped him eliminate the threat to his borders, while I handled threats to mine. When a third party attempted to exploit our conflict by attacking supply lines, we coordinated response without formal agreement. These small collaborations proved that we could work together effectively. That partnership multiplied our individual strengths rather than compromising them. Zhang recognized, as I did, that two strategic minds thinking together created possibilities that neither could achieve independently. The formal alliance required careful structuring to serve both parties' interests while preventing future conflicts between us. We established clear boundaries, shared resource commitments, coordinated decision-making processes, and created mechanisms for resolving disagreements without resorting to warfare. The results exceeded both our expectations. Combined, our forces dominated regional conflicts that had previously challenged either of us individually. Our shared intelligence networks provided information neither could have gathered alone. Our coordinated strategies confused and overwhelmed enemies who had developed tactics against our individual approaches but couldn't adapt to our unified efforts. My framework for identifying potential allies in unexpected places became systematic. Look for people whose capabilities complement rather than duplicate your own, whose strategic objectives align with yours, even if immediate interests seem conflicting, and whose character and competence you respect even when their methods differ from yours. The strategic value of building mutually beneficial relationships with competitors applies directly to modern professional environments. Industry rivals can become partners in lobbying efforts, standard-setting initiatives, or responses to external regulatory threats. Professional competitors can become allies in advancing shared interests, developing new markets, or addressing common challenges. Building win-win scenarios requires moving beyond zero-sum thinking to recognize opportunities where multiple parties can benefit simultaneously. This might mean sharing resources that are abundant for you but scarce for potential partners, or combining complementary strengths to create capabilities neither party could develop independently. The treaty seal reminds me that the strongest position is often achieved not through defeating all opposition, but through converting opposition into support through strategic partnership that serves everyone's legitimate interests. The inventor's notebook on my shelf contains sketches of unconventional weapons and tactics that turned impossible situations into inevitable victories, innovations born from the understanding that conventional thinking leads to predictable defeats, while creative solutions create paths where others see only obstacles. This notebook taught me that warriors must be innovators, not just implementers of traditional approaches. The impossible situation that forced me to create entirely new strategies began when I found my forces trapped in a valley with superior enemy numbers controlling every conventional escape route. Traditional military doctrine offered no solutions. We lacked the strength to fight through any of the blocked passages, insufficient supplies to outlast a siege, and no terrain advantages to offset our numerical disadvantage. Every military manual I had studied suggested surrender or desperate charges with minimal probability of success. But desperate situations demand more than conventional wisdom. They require breakthrough thinking that creates new possibilities from existing resources. Instead of trying to fight our way out or wait for rescue, I developed an approach that no military text had ever described. We would make the enemy want to let us leave. Using psychological analysis and creative resource deployment, I created the illusion that our position was exactly where we wanted to be, not a trap, but a strategic choice that served larger objectives they couldn't see. I had my forces begin constructing permanent fortifications that suggested we intended to establish a lasting base in the valley. I sent messages through channels I knew were compromised, describing fictional reinforcements and supply lines that would make our position genuinely strong. I even began negotiations with local populations about long-term governance arrangements. The enemy commander, General Wei, faced a strategic dilemma I had created through creative interpretation of our constraints. If our position was as advantageous as it appeared, blockading us might be doing exactly what we wanted. If reinforcements were truly coming, his forces might soon be the ones trapped between our positions and arriving allies. Within 2 weeks, Wei began probing for face-saving ways to end the confrontation without appearing to retreat from an inferior opponent. I provided those opportunities by proposing territorial adjustments that gave him tangible gains while allowing our forces to redeploy to other priorities. We escaped what seemed like certain destruction by transforming our greatest weakness being trapped, to an apparent strategic advantage. This experience taught me that innovation begins with rejecting the assumption that current constraints represent permanent limitations. Instead of asking, how can we overcome these obstacles, I learned to ask, how can we use these obstacles as assets? Instead of trying to eliminate problems, I found ways to make problems work in my favor. My approach to finding solutions where others see only problems became systematic. First, identify all assumptions about what the constraints prevent or require. Second, challenge each assumption by asking whether the opposite might be possible under different conditions. Third, experiment with small-scale tests of unconventional approaches. Fourth, scale successful innovations while learning from failed experiments. The warrior's mindset for turning constraints into catalysts requires embracing the possibility that limitations often contain their own solutions. Limited resources force efficiency innovations. Restricted options encourage creative combinations. Impossible timelines demand process breakthroughs. The constraint that seems most limiting often points toward the most powerful innovation. The teaching scroll that bears my original manuscript represents the moment I realized that true warriors think beyond their own immediate victories to the enduring impact of their knowledge. The moment I chose to document strategic principles rather than guard them as personal secrets. This scroll taught me that sharing wisdom multiplies rather than diminishes your power, because legacy lives in the minds you shape, not the battles you win. The decision to record my strategic insights came after a conversation with a young officer who reminded me of myself decades earlier, brilliant, eager, but making the same costly mistakes I had made when pride prevented me from learning from others' experiences. Watching him struggle with challenges I had already solved, I realized that knowledge dies with its possessor unless deliberately preserved and transmitted. Initially, I resisted the idea of writing down what I had learned through years of difficult experience. Military secrets had always been closely guarded. Sharing strategic knowledge seemed like giving advantages to potential enemies, diluting the competitive edge that separated successful commanders from failed ones. But deeper reflection revealed the flaw in this thinking. My strategic principles worked not because they were secret, but because they were true. Effective strategies remain effective even when widely known, because most people lack the discipline to implement them consistently or the wisdom to adapt them creatively to new situations. More importantly, I began to understand that true strength comes from building others rather than defeating them. A leader who creates other leaders multiplies their impact far beyond what individual achievement can accomplish. A strategist who develops strategic thinkers influences outcomes long after their own active involvement ends. I chose to document my knowledge because I recognized that lasting victory requires building systems that succeed without depending entirely on exceptional individuals. Armies led by trained strategic thinkers perform better than armies dependent on single brilliant commanders. Organizations guided by sound principles adapt more successfully than organizations relying solely on founder vision. The teaching scroll became my attempt to codify not just specific tactics, but the thinking processes that generate effective tactics in any situation. Instead of providing rigid rules, I tried to capture flexible principles that could be applied across different contexts, cultures, and time periods. Writing required me to examine my own strategic development more carefully than I ever had while actively campaigning. I had to identify which insights were genuinely universal versus which were specific to my particular circumstances. I had to distinguish between successful tactics and the underlying principles that made those tactics successful. The process revealed that my most valuable knowledge was not about specific battle formations or diplomatic techniques, but about how to think strategically under pressure, how to see opportunities in apparent obstacles, How to maintain clarity when others become confused by complexity. My vision for how warrior thinking can transform societies extends beyond military applications to any competitive environment where strategic thinking provides advantages. The same principles that win wars can build businesses, advance careers, resolve conflicts, and achieve personal objectives that seemed impossible through conventional approaches. The responsibility that comes with possessing superior knowledge is to use it in service of worthy objectives, not merely personal advancement. True warriors understand that power creates obligation, the obligation to use strength in ways that ultimately benefit rather than harm the communities that produced and supported that strength. The unsheathed sword that rests on my desk remains sharp only through constant user blade that taught me that warrior thinking, like any weapon, maintains its edge through daily practice rather than occasional application. This sword represents your moment of choice. Will you remain a reactive thinker, or will you forge yourself into a strategic warrior who shapes circumstances rather than being shaped by them? Your transformation from reactive thinker to strategic warrior begins with recognizing that every challenge you currently face contains the raw materials for your development. That difficult boss who seems impossible to please is teaching you to understand complex motivations and adapt your communication accordingly. That competitive colleague who blocks your advancement is showing you how to build alliances and position yourself more strategically. That financial pressure that keeps you awake at night is forcing you to think creatively about resource management and opportunity identification. The daily practices that maintain and strengthen warrior mindset are deceptively simple but require consistent commitment. Each morning, before the day's reactive pressures begin, spend 10 minutes identifying the single most strategic action you could take that day, not the most urgent task or the most enjoyable activity, but the one move that would best advance your position. Then ensure that action happens regardless of what other demands arise. Each evening, conduct a brief strategic review using 3 questions. What did I learn about myself today? What did I learn about others that could inform future interactions? What assumption did I make that proved incorrect? And how can I think more accurately tomorrow? This reflection transforms daily experiences into strategic intelligence that accumulates over time. My challenge to you requires identifying your first warrior thinking opportunity in the next 24 hours. Look at your current obstacles and choose one where you can apply strategic thinking instead of reactive responses. Instead of complaining about a problem, analyze its structure to find leverage points. Instead of avoiding a difficult person, study their motivations to understand how to work with them effectively. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by circumstances, break down complex situations into manageable strategic choices. The commitment required to sustain this transformation over time is significant because warrior thinking opposes your natural psychological tendencies toward emotional reactions, comfortable assumptions, and conventional approaches. You will face constant pressure to revert to reactive patterns, especially when stress increases or when strategic thinking produces slower results than you want. Recognize the warning signs that you're slipping back into soft thinking patterns, making decisions based on emotions rather than strategic analysis, avoiding difficult conversations that could advance your position, focusing on activities that feel productive rather than actions that create genuine progress, seeking comfort and certainty rather than growth and strategic advantage. How to apply these principles immediately in your current challenges starts with reframing whatever situation is causing you the most stress right now. Instead of asking, why is this happening to me? Ask, how can I use this situation to develop strategic capabilities? Instead of seeking to eliminate the challenge, look for ways to navigate it that build strength, knowledge, relationships, or position for future opportunities. Your legacy as a warrior thinker in the modern world will be measured not by the battles you win, but by the strategic thinking capabilities you develop and the example you set for others who face their own challenges. Every time you respond strategically instead of reactively, you demonstrate that warrior thinking is possible in contemporary contexts. The unsheathed sword reminds us that unused weapons become dull, untested strategies become worthless theories, and undeveloped capabilities remain forever potential rather than actual strength. Your warrior transformation requires you to embrace the discomfort of thinking differently, acting strategically, and taking responsibility for outcomes, rather than remaining a victim of circumstances. Today, you stand at the same crossroads every warrior faces. Continue reacting to life as it happens to you, or begin shaping life according to your strategic vision. The choice is yours, but choose quickly. Every day spent in reactive thinking is a day that could have been used to build the strategic capabilities that will determine your future success. The warrior within you has always existed, waiting for this moment of recognition and commitment. Now is the time to pick up your weapons, not swords and spears, but the strategic thinking tools that will serve you in every battle you face from this day forward.